thirdly, yes, I have 3 videos, 1 minute each, where they destroy the tomb.
Yeah, right.
I think it's more practical if, when it's my turn, I ask the technician to show because
them
if we show here, it sounds kind of provocation. No one understands why we are burning the Quran or destroying the Christian tombs. So maybe I will keep very short and show the video.
Okay.
So start from Dan is just right coming from the White House.
Yeah.
So we could start with him. He's fresh news.
He just said not first.
Not first. It's not correct?
Yeah, I noticed that. I was like, okay.
No, he left. I think
You got a big marker, we can change it, right?
No,
You talking about Pablo?
No, Tadros, his own name is not there.
You're right.
I think he went to the restroom. I mean, I don't mind. I just want to know
You're right. Wherever you want. Sit here.
I'll move myself down here.
We can correct that as we go along. Yeah, I was looking, I was saying, okay, wait a minute, is this the same guy?
where. Hello. So, who's nice to meet you?
I have no idea. How are you, Dan Robinson? How are you?
Samuel. I was looking for the room auditorium in the Leeds building, so I finally discovered, even though I'm a professor here.
Have you been back to Egypt? Or?
No, I was just in Egypt.
Yeah, we
before.
actually have, I think,
January.
Yeah.
Okay.
I had spent a month there. Just I returned the day before the.
So now that we paid the bail, what do you think?
It's unbelievable how the situation.
You're with Georgia State?
Yes.
Karim, it says Johns
But
Hopkins.
it tells you
Yes,
something
SAIS.
about the dynamics.
Here,
You're
SAIS.
teaching here?
Yeah, I'm teaching the North Africa class.
Very fascinating. I mean, I still have some of the quotes from the Hudson, which I thought was fascinating. Just, it's clear there's a dealing with this.
Someone, your name will come very soon. She forgot it.
Fine.
Sit here, Pablo.
We have a five minutes each.
Ambassador Kurt Volker, Pablo Pardo, the Minister.
Hi. And we have 5 minutes each, right?
Something like that.
Okay. All right.
And do you need to leave early, or
So
are you
there,
okay now?
there is a
Quarter to 3.
So you can speak
there
for
is
Right.
a person
And
called
Daniel?
Pardo.
Yeah.
Are you okay on time, or do you have to rush out?
No, I'm fine.
Okay.
I'm sorry. What order are we in, and how
I'll be
much?
talking
About
about
5 minutes.
Okay.
5 minutes. All of us.
Yeah.
Okay, ladies and gentlemen, you can hear me, I hope? Okay. Thank you very much for coming. My name is Kurt Volker. I'm a senior fellow here associated with the Center for Transatlantic Relations at SAIS. You may wonder why the Center for Transatlantic Relations is putting on an event about the Arab Spring. And the answer is because A, it's a good idea, and B, because we have an absolutely fantastic Italian fellow at our center, Daniele Moro, who is a recovering journalist and has spent his time at the Center for Transatlantic Relations over the past year and a bit more, really digging in great depth about the Arab Spring and the issues involved. I don't think that you will find a person who loves the Arab people and the Arab countries more than he does, or is more critical and more direct and frank about the challenges that they face as well. And so he's been a tremendous addition to our center, and it's because of Daniele that we have these kind of events, which I have found to be among the most interesting that we have been able to carry out. We have a very diverse and distinguished group of panelists. I will introduce each of them as we come to them rather than go through all of that now. Since I want to do a little bit of self-advertising as well. I'm in the process not only of being a senior fellow here at SAIS, but of setting up a new institute with Arizona State University named after John McCain. It'll be the McCain Institute for International Leadership. And if any of you want to talk with me about that some other time, my email is kurt.volker@gmail.com. But I hope that we can work together on many things. For the discussion today, we are 1 year after the beginning of the Arab Spring. And on the one hand, that started with Tunisia and Libya and then to Egypt, and we had a sense of what that meant in terms of removing established authoritarian regimes, people expressing democratic aspirations, and running the risks that these kind of revolutions or democratic aspirations can be hijacked or go off track. That's sort of what we knew going into this. It's interesting the way that a year has gone by and what has developed, because we are now facing the fact of a reasonably successful transition in Tunisia, still a lot to do. We are wondering where Libya will be going now. We no longer have Muammar Gaddafi, but on the other hand, it has not fully gelled as a new political and economic entity. I think we have reason to be hopeful in Libya, but we're not there yet. Egypt, I think we have reasons for great concern over where things are headed in Egypt over time. And then, of course, we've seen beyond those three countries, we've seen demonstrations and repression of demonstrations in places like Bahrain. We've seen a real collapse in Yemen without a new order coming in there. We have a raging war going on in Syria where Bashar Assad is attacking his own people every day. To this is being added the question of what to do about Iran. What is Iran's role in Syria or in some of these other groups? And with Benjamin Netanyahu's visit here yesterday, the Israeli-Iranian factor, and that draws the U.S. into the region, even as we've tried to avoid being drawn into the region in other ways. So it has become a much more complex, volatile, and dangerous situation, I would argue, a year on. Still with a great deal of hope and human aspiration, but with a great deal of complexity and danger at the same time. And I hope that we can have a discussion about all of the aspects of that today. I haven't prepared our panel for who I'm going to call upon first, but I'm going to take the advice of Daniele as we were chatting about who is who here, and turn first to Samuel Tadros, who is with the Hudson Institute here in Washington, D.C., and I'll ask you to say a couple more words about yourself and then give us some of your thoughts on these issues that I've put forward in the introduction.
Well, first, thank you for the kind invitation of coming and participating in the panel here today. When asked to come and join the panel, I was given a small hint: be as politically incorrect as you could, which I intend to be. The first question that was posed, or the main question that was posed about the Arab Spring, looking at it 1 year after, is how much we got right and how much we got wrong about that Arab Spring. The question of whether Western journalists were enthusiastic or not about it presumes that many of the things that we got about the Arab Spring, many of the early reporting wasn't entirely accurate. That faced with the test of reality, many of the initial assumptions didn't prove to be correct. Now that many of those didn't prove to be correct seems like an obvious conclusion for anyone watching the picture of Egypt at the moment. Things didn't go exactly in the smooth way that the reporting assumed initially. That, however, is an assumption that many still don't have. Faced with the reality of how Egypt has not gone smoothly, of how Egypt has not transitioned into that rosy road towards democracy, we still get those explanations of, no, wait, we did get it right, but there are some complications in the road. I thus intend to cover in those 5 minutes or 7 minutes the question of what exactly was that early image that we had, how did it face reality, and the attempts to explain it of why it didn't. The first image that we got out of Egypt was that of a liberal, young, tech-savvy generation that is demonstrating in the streets, bringing down the dictator. Who needs to worry when one has such good guys? The Google guy, Wael Ghunim, the international figure, Mohammed al-Baradei. Those guys were people that you could look at and view as the great guys. Now, 1 year after, it's obvious that Mohammed al-Baradei, after polling at about 2% in every poll conducted in Egypt, wasn't really that important to the story. Faced with that reality, of course, he has been forced to withdraw from the Egyptian presidential elections. Wael Ghunim, the Google guy, is left now to writing books. Again, his importance to the story, a huge question mark. The second of those images is about the Islamists that were there or weren't there. We were initially told that the Islamists would either split because of their youth abandoning them, that they would, the Salafis of course don't exist in the first place, we're talking about the Muslim Brotherhood. They've been used and abused by Mubarak. They weren't really something that scary. They were only a minority. The revolution had transcended that Islamist secular divide. 1 year after, it's quite obvious for anyone watching Egypt that instead of regressing, Islamism has only come to the forefront, with 72% of the lower chamber in the Egyptian elections and 85% of the upper chamber. Islamism has not disappeared, but has become the reality and the face of Egypt. The third is that about Israel, or how Israel wasn't part of the story. My favorite line from those early reporting was Anderson Cooper, who, standing in Cairo, told his audience in CNN that everyone he met in Cairo was in love with the US and Israel. Of course, it remains to be proven where exactly he was. Perhaps he was in Israel and not in Cairo. But that idea of Israel not being a factor in the uprising, not being a factor in the minds of the Egyptian people, and not being part of the story. The other one, of course, that image of religious unity, of Muslims and Christians praying together in Tahrir Square, in love with each other. Sectarian issues are not part of the Arab Spring. We need not worry about the fate of religious minorities. We've seen, of course, a dramatic increase in the number of attacks against religious minorities and an exodus of those minorities, numbering from Egypt with 100,000 Christians leaving the country since the revolution. Perhaps the underlying assumption of all of this is the simplistic narrative of the good guys versus the bad guys. There's the bad dictator, and there are those fighting him, who happen to be the nice people that we need to support. There's the image of a bright future ahead. There's a consideration of any obstacle in the road as minor. We need not worry about those things that they might face. The transition will move forward. Now, as Egypt has not come to that bright future that the early reporting assumed, instead of focusing on what we got wrong, we got a number of attempts at explaining how the narrative actually wasn't so bad. The first I would term the Thomas Friedmann approach. Friedmann, faced with the reality that every single column he wrote about Egypt initially was wrong, decided to give us the argument of the flying elephants. If you see the flying elephants, you need not write anything about it. If Egypt witnesses those changes, no one knew about them. No one could have expected such a thing. It's like expecting elephants to fly. Of course, some people did predict how this would happen. He didn't. The second narrative is that of the new bad guys in town. Instead of blaming Mubarak, as we've seen over the year, Of course, we've seen multiple wonderful stories about the guy, from Elliot Spitzer's 70 billion that Mubarak had stashed somewhere, dollars of course we're speaking, to last week in the Egyptian newspapers mentioning that the guy had actually stolen $5 trillion, which is higher than Egypt's GDP in the last 200 years, of course. But instead of Hosni Mubarak, we got the new bad guys in town. It's the military. If something isn't going right in Egypt, it must be the military's fault. Now, of course, the military does have a lot of problems, and we might discuss them later, but this narrative of the bad guys that are stopping Egypt from moving into the right direction is the second approach. The third, perhaps, is that of the regime not falling completely. The reason that Egypt is not moving as smoothly as we predicted is that the remnants of the regime are there, or that we didn't actually bring Mubarak down. We still have to bring him down, and once that is done, Egypt will move into that right direction. The narrative of course, the last one being that of attempting to give a brighter image of reality. The Islamists might have won the elections, but we don't need really to worry about Islamism. It will either disappear in the future, meaning the Islamists will fail economically, and in the next elections people will vote for someone else. Or these guys aren't really bad guys. If anyone reads, for example, Christoph's articles in the New York Times, it's about those nice Islamists that are really moderate, that aren't really as bad as people might think they are. I don't know how much time I...
Well, are you coming to a conclusion?
I think the last question, of course, that should be on people's mind is, why did we get that image wrong? What led to those journalists misunderstanding the situation or getting this wrong narrative? And perhaps we can discuss that better in questions or so.
Sure. In a way, I just want to comment on one thing quickly. What you're describing is an old phenomenon, not a new one, which is the desire to have a single question and a single simple answer and move on, when in fact things are complicated and they take a long time. And the particular issues that we face are ones of the tyranny of the majority, which people have been writing about for hundreds of years in a democracy. How do you prevent the majority from tyrannizing the minority? And I don't think that the fact that that has not been solved in Egypt or in other cases is itself an argument for not having a go at it. So that would be some of my own comment on it. I don't know if you want to respond to that.
Definitely. I think the challenges facing Egypt might be, there might be different particular circumstances to Egypt, but it is definitely facing challenges that all countries moving into that direction would face. But I don't think the question is whether Egypt would face challenges or not. It definitely will. The question, at least for that interests me most, was why didn't people assume that it would? What made people assume that Egypt was going into that, would have a smooth transition, or that things would be bright and we can move to the next blossoming flower of the Arab Spring?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you. Terrific. Let me turn this way and ask Professor Friedmann, Robbie Friedmann from Georgia State University, give us your take on some of these same issues, having heard this and given some of your own thought to it as well.
Well, thank you, and thank you for the invitation. And I was attracted by the fact that Danielle defined this session as politically incorrect. I don't think that I've seen it in any university before, so that's quite attractive. I am a recovered criminologist and a recovered academic. I retired in September 10, so I can really say what I can think because I don't have to be in any faculty meeting anymore. You don't get that.
I think we do get it.
Okay. Let me perhaps talk a little bit about the terms of reference, and I want to put some stuff in perspective, and maybe since Samuel mentioned Tom Friedman, no relationship, he does not know how to spell his last name. there's a story about him going to the Emperor of Japan and interviewing him about his new book. And he wants to know about Japan. And the Emperor says, Mr. Friedmann, what is the title of your book? And he says, Japan, yesterday, today, and tomorrow. And the Emperor says, in a very gracious manner, he says, and Mr. Friedmann, when did you arrive in Japan? He says, yesterday. And when are you leaving Japan? He says, tomorrow. And I think in a sense, and by the way, Daniel stays much more than those 2 days in the country. I think what that does, it typifies what has been known before as the McDonaldization syndrome. We want results, we want them immediately, we cannot delay gratification, we want democratization now. But the whole concept of the nation state is fairly new. The concept of democracy is not universally shared. And I think that if we're talking about a diagnosis of a situation, the expectation ad hoc to have democracy happen overnight, irrespective of which country it takes place in, is erroneous to begin with. And it's erroneous because what it ignores is a process. And I think that the romanticized notion, particularly about the Middle East, didn't start today. It goes back even to the days before Lawrence of Arabia. The West had, the West at that time, it was mostly Europe, had a fascination with the Orient. And if you go back to the Sykes-Picot Agreement from 1916, what do you see? Two colonial powers basically determining for the natives where the boundaries are going to be. Nobody, of course, bothered to ask the natives because they were not counted in that equation. That political vacuum is being filled, and I particularly use is being filled, as the time passes by through the emerging regimes that basically fill the vacuum of the controlling powers that are out. And then if you go back to the history of Egypt, you had Farouk, and then you had the revolt of the colonels, and then on, and you see that in Syria, and you see that in Iraq, and you see it in other places. One of the most stable places still to date is Saudi Arabia, because those 5,000 or 6,000 members of the royal family will do whatever they can to protect that kingdom. If there's an ignorance, pun fully intended, of the processes, there's no wonder that there's an ignorance with respect to the intended and anticipated consequences. And to me, the terms of reference, when somebody is talking about the Arab Spring, here is a spring that didn't happen, or it almost happened, in Iran, and most people may not realize it, but Iran is not an Arab country. But it belongs to that part of the Middle East, and it does have aspirations beyond solving medical issues in the Middle East neighborhood. Pun fairly intended. So it appears to me that rather than developing a romanticized set of terms of reference of how to treat the Arab Spring, I think we ought to perhaps look for different positions than the Meteorological Service or the Botanical Gardens of daffodils, and move away from Hungary and Czechoslovakia, because we're dealing with different societies, with different social processes, with different socioeconomic structures, and with different cultural backgrounds that are not exactly responsive to, I would even say, noble yet naive Western expectations. And I think that in a sense, while it's perfectly fine for the West to show compassion and to offer assistance, it really needs to butt out from meddling in Middle Eastern affairs.
Likewise, let me ask you a question as well, just based on the very tail end of what you said there. Do you believe that there are universal values, such as in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, or do you think that the cultural differences are so great that you can't really talk about that?
No, you can talk about anything. The issue is, can we impose that system on somebody who may not be immediately willing to do that because, or to accept it because they're occupied with other issues. And I think that...
By other people.
Or by other people, of course. So I think that, of course, promotion of universal human rights is a noble value. But we publicly did that with Libya. We publicly are not doing it with Syria. So there's, first of all, an inconsistency in the application of, in this particular case, US policy. And that sends a contradictory and confusing message to those who should benefit from the application of universal human rights.
Yeah, no, I totally agree with your point on inconsistency. That was asked, I believe it was Bill Burns, Deputy Secretary of State, how he viewed that. And his response to that was, you do what you can, which is a reasonable response as well, that you can't do everything, but you do what you can. But I want to push you one more bit, and then we'll turn to another speaker on the idea, because you used the phrase imposition of universal human values. And I would argue that you can't impose them because they're inherent. And all you can do is restrict them. And that's what a lot of what we see happening in many countries in the world, not only in the Middle East, is about.
I would say this, as a long-term objective, and if we're patient, it's a noble goal to aspire to. If we try to do this and expect results tomorrow, it's not going to happen.
Okay, thank you. Let me turn to another speaker here, and I will pick up right where you left off with Karim Mezran, who is a professor here at Johns Hopkins SAIS.
Thank you very much, Kurt, and thank you very much for the invitation here. Thanks to Daniele for having organized this extremely interesting panel, to which I'll try to contribute as much as possible. My task was, the 5 minutes, was to talk about Libya, or use Libya as an example for talking about Islamist winter. To take a point that Tadros talked about it, I think that there is another question to be asked, and that is why, or we didn't ask, how come that Islamists were not present? In the sense that when first the revolt in Libya happened, I used Libya as a litmus test of this. When everything happened and it was spontaneous and blah, 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 despite what Al Jazeera said, I don't want to get into that. At a certain point, one correspondent from CNN enters into Benghazi for the first time, and what we see was the whole population, Libyan flags, American flags, French flags, British flags, people yelling CNN, CNN. There was not one Allah Akbar, there was not one beard, there was not one green flag, etc. And I was very surprised by that. And I said, well, we were all wrong as scholars in continuing to talk about the Muslim Brotherhood, the Islamists as the only opposition, because here it is a whole mass of people that we didn't know about it, that probably were being prepared by Twitter, Blogger, all those buzzwords that we have heard, and in their houses, and we could not figure it out, and they were out. Well, you're right. So how come that then all of a sudden it took us May or April with the assassination of General Abdel Yunis to discover that most of the brigades were controlled by the Islamists, and that the Muslim Brotherhood, even though they don't say that it's a Muslim Brotherhood, is the strongest component of the revolt, and blah, 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 blah. So if one adds the two things together, that's the question that is probably for historians or analysts to discuss. How come that even spontaneously they were not there for the beginning of the revolt? Was it coordinated? Was it because some say just a reaction? Yeah, but you react, but also how you don't react. In the sense, if everybody's on the streets, how come you don't go? If you're there. I don't know if I'm making any sense with that. Having said that, I think that two of the most important things that happened with this revolt, with the so-called Arab Spring, which is a term that I don't like particularly, are first of all that no matter what, finally the much derided Arab street has appeared. People went to the street. And that is something we should not discard, we should not forget. Arabs, for probably the first time, maybe not, really took their destiny into their hands and went down the streets and fought and did what they did for whatever reason there was, but they came to be present, and that is something we cannot discard, we cannot forget. But second, and more important, is Islamism. Having kept them, whether in the form of the Muslim Brotherhood, whether from other parties, at the margins of the political apparatus in the last 20 years has been a mistake. I continuously, and I'm strongly feeling about that. They should have been co-opted into the political system much sooner or in the process. And that is one of the other positive, I still think it's positive, effects of these revolts, that they finally come to the fore. And they are going to take responsibility, and they're going to have to take side, and they're going to have to act and politically work into the various political systems. Having said that, and going to the particular case of Libya, I should say that I don't see in the Islamist groups, even the most extreme one, a real risk or a threat, because in a sense they are submerged into what is Islam in Libya, which is a highly conservative country, and Islam is actually or probably will play the role of being the unifying factor, which I think is where the risk for Libya lies today, is in fragmentation. We have been talking about the fact that the country could have been split, and it wasn't split during the civil war. It runs the risk to be split now. Why? Because we ignored completely the fact that for 40 years, but even before that, there has not been an active creation of a national identity, an active foster a national identity. Gaddafi tried to do all he could to demolish it, so the Libyans found themselves with, the moment you take that out, they find themselves with the regional or the local identity, which could have been useful had we gone through a different process of election from the basis up to the top. But that's not what is happening. And the declaration of independence yesterday, I wouldn't give it too much credit yet, but it's a sign that there are regional situations that are being developed. They might get to split the country because the unifying factor is not there. And that, I think, is the word. And Islam can play at the end a unifying role in two forms, one good, one bad. One good, if participating to the elections under the name of Islam, political parties can play the ideological role of keeping the country united. And one bad is if in front of the risk of having the split of the country, the Islamist militias get together and stage a coup d'etat or a move that then will install a unifying government.
I just wanted to interject to ask if you would explain the Declaration of Independence that you mentioned.
Yeah, maybe it's not correct to say Declaration of Independence. Groups in Cyrenaica have got together and have declared that Cyrenaica is going to be a province per se, if not completely a state per se, and they have a larger autonomy from the capital. It's very confused, but I see sign of something that has happened already 50 years ago. At the time of independence, what pushed Libya in a certain direction was the fact that the Emir of Cyrenaica proclaimed the independence of Cyrenaica in 49, I think, exactly that, and that blackmailed the rest of the Fezzanese and the Tripolitanians in order to come together and then accept a federal government. So probably this is a repetition of that. It's again an attempt by certain powers in Cyrenaica to push the situation in the government in such a way to declare a federation with large autonomies so that they could govern their part within a unitary Libya that is just very weak.
Mm-hmm. And let me ask the Ronald Reagan question here. Is Libya better off today than it was 2 years ago?
Yes. Yes.
All right. Let me turn to our next speakers. I'm sure people will ask about that, but I agree with you. Let me turn next to Pablo Pardo, who's the Washington correspondent for El Mundo, and give us your take on the same set of issues.
Thank you very much. Well, I'm going to try to defend, first of all, journalists a little bit, just for split the corpse. And I mean, particularly with regarding to the thing that elephants fly, according to the laws of physics, bumblebees couldn't fly. It wasn't discovered until 10 years ago. And actually, the very well-respected IMF wrote a paper called, titled something like Bumblebees Fly. And it was about Sweden, because according to all the economic laws used by the IMF around 99, Sweden should be an extremely poor country, which tells a lot about the problem of analyzing things from Washington, D.C. Well, having said this, I think that, well, with this whole thing of the spring, the Arab Spring, the winter, the Arab Winter. There's some anecdote or something that happened many years ago when many people here hadn't been born yet, which is in 1979 in the newspaper I worked for, or in its predecessor. There was a journalist who spoke perfectly good Arabic and Farsi, who had interviewed Ayatollah Khomeini when he was in Paris. And everybody still remembers, actually her daughter ended up coming to SAIS to study and getting a PhD here. And everybody remembers what, when Khomeini came back to Iran, she went to the newspaper very early in the morning, and she, like, you feel all the doors and the windows and everything with pictures from of Khomeini. That obviously was a complete mistake on her part, and but I think this is not just part. I mean, the mistake in analyzing the Arab Spring, I don't think is just a mistake of the Western media, the European media, or the American media. I think it goes deeper into our society, and it's some sort of revolutionary myth, which is something that we always fell into. Is what Anatol Lieven, who is now in London, but he used to be here at Carnegie and then the New American Foundation, talked, for instance, when talking about Iraq, the Polish myth. I mean, in Poland it worked, but traditionally revolutions haven't been democratic. They have been sometimes, they haven't been others. Even the Iranian revolution, according to some people, it involved like 10% of the population. That's really huge. The French Revolution apparently didn't involve more than 2%. And when we look at how Iran was at the time, when Khomeini came, it was actually a strange coalition of communists, ayatollahs and mullahs, and part of the middle class. Actually, the first prime minister in Iran was Mehdi Basargan, who was a completely secular guy who had written about how evolution and religion could go together, and he was actually implying that evolution was, religion was a product of evolution. And the day before the US embassy in Tehran was taken over by the Islamists, there was an article in the New Republic written by a very well-known journalist, whose name I can't remember right now, but I know he ended up in the New York Times, saying that probably Iran would end up being a communist country, because today the Communist Party of Iran was extremely powerful at the time. Then there was virtually a civil war, and the Ayatollahs literally wiped them out. So I think there's this natural tendency in the West to always celebrate revolutions no matter what. And it's not just in the media. I mean, we have now Anne-Marie Slaughter from Princeton University very recently saying that the US and NATO countries should basically intervene in Syria, even though apparently, I mean, it's very fascinating because nobody's asking who are the Syrian rebels. I was last week with Michael Rubin, who is at the American Enterprise Institute, but he was in the Defense Department during the Bush era, and he teaches at the National Defense University. He's also a total advocate of intervening in Syria and creating a safe haven, kind of the one created by the Americans for the Kurds in northern Iraq. But then when I asked him, who are the Syrian rebels, he said, well, we don't really know very well. So, I mean, this kind of gung-ho mentality, I think, is absolutely key. And then we have also political opportunism. I think that the NATO's intervention in Libya was fundamentally the pet war of Nicolas Sarkozy, basically. And Americans were far from happy about it, or at least that's the the feeling I have. Likewise, there's also a problem with diplomats, and I think that this in a school like SAIS can be very interesting, because I've heard also the high officers officials in the U.S. State Department saying that, well, basically the main problem that the Arab Spring is creating to us is the fact that we used to have a one-suit-fits-all policy for the whole region for 18 countries, and now we're having to develop a separated and different set of policies for every country, which is, well, rather amazing. I mean, it's this is like diplomacy is like iPads or something like that. You make the same and sell it to everybody. Then, I mean, the next thing to ask is to what extent you think it was safe having a diplomacy based on relying on octogenarian cancer-stricken dictators with dynastic dreams. Are you surprised by what is happening? And so I think there is fundamentally a very deep tendency to Leonize revolutions in general, particularly when they happen far, far away. I think that the Europeans have been much more cautious in this because the Italians know a little bit about Libyan refugees and so on. But I think this is one of the main problems, and it's also a very big problem for diplomats, which is something that happens not only in the Arab countries but in every dictatorship. When a democratic country has an embassy in a dictatorship, you are immediately in a conundrum, because either you establish relations with the government, in which case you are not going to have anything to talk about with the opposition or the civil society, or you do the opposite, and then the government will punish you, will punish your companies, or whatever. So I think that right now, I mean, I'm not really extremely surprised by what's going on. And when we talk about people like Tom Friedman, well, I mean, Tom Friedman, he said that the invasion of Iraq was going to be fantastic and incredible, and it was going to create democracy all over the Middle East. Nick Kristof loves putting things in black and white, and so I mean that's the way they operate, and it's an extremely interesting way. I think that what nobody, or at least that's my feeling, or very few people are actually saying or putting into the debate right now is, well, apparently, at least in some of these countries, particularly in Egypt, there's going to be some sort of coalition, probably between the Islamists and the military. What does it mean? How are we going to deal with that? I mean, because one important thing of this revolution is that Al-Qaeda, for instance, or that sort of extreme Salafist, crazy Islam movements haven't shown up. Actually, it has been a big defeat for them. There have been other Islamist movements. But we know that when Islamists rule either in the Palestinian territories or up to a point, we can say, in some parts of Pakistan or Saudi Arabia, they don't generate stable governments either, but the West gets trapped in the same trap as before. It's like, okay, these people aren't good, these people aren't nice, but the alternative is chaos. Now when some people talk about canceling U.S. military aid to Egypt, I mean, U.S. military aid to Egypt, I'm pretty sure that there are people here who know way better than me, but I think is part of it, at least, is stated in the Camp David agreements. If you start challenging the Camp David agreements, you can start challenging the idea of peace for territories, which has been the tenet of the Western policy in the Middle East. So I think that what has happened so far is relatively understandable historically, and And the fact that really surprises me is the fact that apparently, at least, the West, meaning the US and Europe, are simply reacting to the events, or at least that's the image they portray.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to move things along to our other panelists, and I'll come back with a couple questions for you, but I want to bring in others who haven't had a chance to speak yet. And let me turn first to Daniel Robinson, who is the White House correspondent for the Voice of America. And then we'll come to Daniela, who I think wants to show us a couple of videos as well, and then I'll try to open up a discussion. So.
Okay, thanks. Well, I'm going to do two things I usually do when I'm doing my job every day, which one is to cut the script and cut my story short, a little bit shorter. And the other is to read you the lead of the story, which, of course, if you've been attentive to your iPhones and your BlackBerries, you will have already have seen. So just before we all arrived here, President Obama in the news conference at the White House said about Syria, for us to take military action unilaterally, as someone suggested, Senator McCain yesterday, along with some others, or think somehow some simple solution, I think, is a mistake. And he went on to compare it with the Libyan situation. I think some of the things you're hearing from Sam and Karim and others on this panel illustrate the complexity of the situations that the administration has been dealing with from the start. I first want to say I'm not here so much as a Arab Spring expert. I have not been on the ground in any Arab Spring countries, but just as a White House reporter observing the responses I have over the past year or so. The president faced various criticisms. I won't recite them all. You know what the story has been over the last year. It was said he was timid. He was supposedly failing to formulate a coherent and effective response. The response reflected a failure to understand or grasp events on the ground. In May of last year, you know, in his major Middle East speech at the State Department, he emphasized the importance of human rights, laid out the principles, the importance of youth in the region, the importance of economic support. And he said the U.S. could not prevent every injustice perpetrated by a regime against its people, but essentially put the administration on record that while being realistic, the policy would be based on core principles opposing violence and upholding universal rights. So we saw the evolution of the policy on Libya, the growth of the NATO operation. I was with the president in South America, and I saw that process playing out. I saw them having to deal with that situation on the fly as the first bombs went in and missiles dropped. We also saw the administration struggle with criticisms of its Libya policy where the War Powers Act was concerned. On the other hand, though events in Libya are now quite worrying, encompassing all kinds of scenarios, the president was also praised for the approach. I recall, I believe it was an Ignatius column last October. He said this was an instance when Mr. Cool had it pretty much right, deliberately keeping the U.S. in the background even when critics began howling for a show of American leadership. I also recall when I wrote my story in the president's speech last year in May, I just reviewed it this morning before I came here. The death toll in Syria at that time was 850. I took a close look at that today, and of course now it's 7,000, 7,500. One wonders, what the toll will be in a few weeks' time and what action the international community will have taken. So, again, we all watched and listened to the president's early responses and his statements as popular upheaval in Egypt played out through the ouster of Mubarak, and who, by the way, had been at the White House in 2010 as the president laid out his first effort on Palestinian-Israeli peace efforts. And we're now seeing the administration having to devise an approach in Egypt that recognizes the reality of the election results there and the complex religious and political situation in that country. And some of the things I heard Sam talk about not only here just now, but also at, I think, at a Hudson event in January. At that event, by the way, there's a great quote I will always remember from that. I think it was from Walter Mead. And I'll just repeat it here. He said, "Whoever is president," because I used this in my radio report that day, "is going to make a lot of guesses, and some of the guesses are going to be wrong. And all of us in the press and the think tank world making comments, it is just chatter." I thought that was an interesting remark at the time. So where Syria is concerned, you heard what the president just said in the news conference today. Reporters have observed the administration's response to the crackdown on that version of the Arab Spring. Beginning last August, the president began directly calling for Assad to go to pave the way for a political transition. But again, as we've heard here, the situation in Syria is very complex, to say the least, and it raises questions about what kind of transition there would be even if Assad were to depart tomorrow. I've talked a little bit about Senator McCain's call for the use of air power. In addition to the key focus points, Syria, Egypt, and Libya, the administration has had to build what it thinks will be an effective response to other situations. In Yemen, already mentioned here, for example, where a leader was in power for decades and is now out, but violence is continuing. And that environment also includes important national security considerations where efforts against al-Qaeda are concerned. And less discussed, I think, than the Syrias and the Egypts and Libyas are questions about Arab Spring impacts in such places as Jordan, Saudi Arabia, and Gulf states. Places like Morocco, for example. There was, as I recall, no mention in the Obama speech last year of Saudi Arabia. And finally, just a note on Iran, again, as an observer of the daily give and take in the White House news briefings, remember the president was sharply criticized and continues to be, most recently this morning by Mitt Romney. I don't know if any of you heard his comments to the AIPAC conference, for having failed to sufficiently support the opposition movement there. So it'll be interesting, in my view, to note there's been fairly little talk in daily White House conversations about U.S. support for the Iranian opposition, especially as the nuclear issue has dominated everything. Though, to be fair, also there have been, I'll observe about the journalistic body of journalists there, very few questions on this subject, at least in the daily media briefings. So again, I'm glad to be here. I'm glad someone picked me out of the White House basement to come here and talk about this, and I'm sure you have some interesting questions.
Great. Well, I do want to come to Daniele, but I do want to ask one question here. It's very easy to put up a straw man and then say why it's wrong. So U.S. should not act unilaterally, militarily, okay? There is no simple solution, okay? But what do you do? And I think that's the question that I think you may have some glib answers to from some political candidates, but a president has a responsibility to answer a hard question like that, and I wonder what you think we should do.
I'll just observe that on Syria, for example, that probably is the most has been the most common question at White House news briefings over the past couple of months as the death toll has steadily risen there. And you can sense in those situations, the points at which the language changes in terms of the administration's response. I mean, we went, last year from saying Assad should, either participate in change, or go, to he needs to go. And, so it's the increments that have been interesting to observe. But clearly, the Syria situation presents probably the most complex, as far as I see it, situation for them at this point.
And since you're sitting in that briefing room every day, do you sense time as an issue?
Time and space. Time and space regarding Iran. But, clearly they're going to face, they're facing difficult situations. I mean, Senator McCain yesterday on the floor of the Senate outlined his reasons for thinking that air power should be used and there should be a joint military operation. One wonders how much longer the position that the White House is outlining that we're going to let, these international efforts continue and we're focusing on a political solution, how much longer that can go on.
And to recall, you had the same arguments before the intervention in Libya.
That's right, and and again, I mean, it's either two different situations. Although there are those who I've been reading all the think tank papers also, and there are those who say, look, it really doesn't matter now. You're at 7,500, and counting. There's got to be a way found to get arms into the opposition, or to use air power, for example.
Okay, let me give the floor to Daniele. Daniele's pulled up a couple of videos that he wants to bring up to illustrate some of the challenges that we're facing and then try to explain some of the context of that. and we'll open up for a longer discussion from there. So, Daniele, to you.
Just before showing you, just one is 1 minute and 20, and the other roughly the same. Just before showing you the two videos, which are a bit shocking and probably give us an extreme picture of what's happening. I would like just to say that I have more question than answer about what's happening in the Arab Spring countries, because having been in Tunisia, just to give you an example, my question would be, does exist an alternative between Ben Ali and the Sharia law, polygamy, and so? I still believe we have an alternative. It's still possible to have a country which respects freedom and especially minorities, which I believe, take the Egyptian case, you have 8 million Christians. How will you treat them? Which respect you will have vis-à-vis the Jews or the Christians or the Muslim in Europe? So I just picked a couple of documents. If our friend can show us the first, you can, okay, so.
We probably need to.
Yeah, he's just asking that. Yeah. One is, I think, both are in Libya, and one are about probably mercenaries with Gaddafi, which were taken prisoners. Yes, yes. And they are in a zoo cage somewhere in Libya, and they are blacks. That's why they are believed to be mercenaries. And they are obliged to eat the Gaddafi flag.
Sta suscitando commenti scandalizzati questo video postato sia su YouTube sia su Live Leak. Non si sa a quale zona della Libia si riferisca, ma questi prigionieri, probabilmente lealisti dell'ex dittatore libico Muammar Gheddafi, sono rinchiusi in gabbia all'interno di uno zoo. Secondo quanto scritto da chi ha postato il video su internet, i prigionieri provengono probabilmente dalla cittadina di Tawerga, che era interamente popolata da libici di colore e che, dopo la liberazione da parte dei ribelli di Misurata, è ormai una città fantasma. Le organizzazioni umanitarie denunciano la pulizia etnica nella zona. E fuori campo si sente una voce che incita i prigionieri a mangiare brandelli della bandiera del regime, chiamandoli ripetutamente cani. Allahu Akbar!
Can we see the cemetery, the second? Anyway, you have another link, the second one about the British cemetery in Benghazi. If you, okay, don't worry. You will find, and later we show it. Okay. Did you get?
Okay, let's resume.
So, going back to what I was saying, I have more question than answer. For instance, you just raised the problem of Morocco. I was discussing with my friend Per Augustin the other day. The Morocco transition is probably better, and question, is better because there is a monarchy. In some way you prepare the leaders of your country to a transition. Because as Karim has said correctly, they had no leadership in Libya, nothing to have a transition. It's like in Italy after the Second World War, putting, say, a communist party ideologue to lead the trade ministry? I mean, where do you go? My question is, first about monarchy. The model is probably, someone say yes, someone say no. Second question, is all the money that is going from the Gulf state to the Tunisian, Egypt parties, and so telling us that this was started as an Arab Spring revolution, but is becoming a Sunni-led revolution. And third is a question that I would like to pose to former NATO ambassador, because as a baby boomer in Italy, I remember that in 45 you came to liberate my country, which is Italy. And you gave to Italy, France, Germany, and Britain food, values, and a military shield. And in 60 years, this model has worked. We had been a free country able to develop thanks to the help of our enemies. Mussolini, by the way, declared the Second World War against America before Hitler. Few Italians know, few I think you know, but we did war against you before Germany. You can imagine Italy fighting against America. Second, in 89, we had a similar situation with the fall of Berlin Wall. We gave to the Polish, to the East German, and so values, food, and military shield. Today they are more free than with Putin. Third, and this is my question, what's happening now that we are not giving help, values, and some kind of military protection if they need, to these Arabic countries? We have promised last year more than $30 billion of help to Tunisia and to Egypt. I think we delivered less than 300 million. So we are letting this country, my preoccupation is this. Take Tunisia. In Tunisia, you have divorce and abortion since 1956, before Italy and France. What do you tell to the Tunisian women, to the Libyan women, when the new Libyan authorities say the first law that we will put back is polygamy? You have a situation where women are relatively liberated in this country if you compare with Saudi Arabia, for instance. What is your answer? Is, my question, and it's final, is possible, and I hope, that Islam and democracy can go together or not? Because this is a real problem. If you respect the minorities, it's fine. If you don't respect, the answer is no. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Daniele. Okay. I'd like to open up a bit of a discussion here. And Daniele posed some questions to me, which I'm not going to give a long answer to, but I'll give a short answer to. And I think there's a lack of confidence in the U.S. and in Europe at the moment. It's because of our finances. It's because of our political gridlock. It's because of the attacks that we've had by extremists and terrorists that cause people to say, why should we even bother and care? Why don't we fix our own country instead? And so it's a lack of confidence in ourselves and in our values, and therefore in our ability to make a positive difference, as you gave examples in the past, as we have done. It's a reasonable thing to question, I think. What can we reasonably do? But ultimately, if the answer is unsatisfactory, if the answer is you watch Assad kill his people every day and that continues happening, I think you have to choose, as I was told when I was looking for a job once, you don't choose between what you'd like to do and something else you'd like to do. You choose between offers. You actually have options of what is likely to happen. Either we're going to see what we're seeing today, or you try to influence that in some way. And I do think that it does demand more from all of us, and I wouldn't single out the United States, but also our European allies and Arab allies and friends as well. The other thing I would say is it comes back to the questions that I was posing to Professor Friedmann earlier about universal values, because I think if we view ourselves as acting against a country, we're missing it. we have to view ourselves as supporting the people of a country. And that requires a little bit more nuance and delicacy in the way you do it, but it means that you're not walking away from it either. So those would be a few of the points that I would make. Now, I'd like to ask, I asked Professor Mezran whether Libya was better off than it was 2 years ago, and his answer was yes. Despite military intervention, despite fragmentation, the city-state militias, the Declaration of Independence, the lack of really functioning governing structures, which I also believe, and I think that is an interesting answer to that question. I would like to ask everyone on the panel, just raise your hand. Do you think Tunisia is better off than it was under Ben Ali? Is it a yes for Tunisia or no?
Yes. No, this
Okay. But now the hard...
Is there another response?
Yeah, tell me your response to this. Yeah.
Well, if somebody jumps from the 110th floor of the Sears Tower in Chicago and you ask him on the 80th floor, how you doing? And he says, so far, so good. You have to anchor it in a given time and in a given development. So yeah, maybe today it's going in the right direction, but who on this panel can predict what will happen in a year or two?
Right. No, that's right, and that's you're absolutely right that you can't know the future, but you can know the past and you can know the present, and I think that's some of the question. But the hard question, and I want to ask you, Samuel, first. What about Egypt?
I think the reality is that the Mubarak regime was unsustainable, no matter what the U.S. response would have been. I don't believe that the U.S. contributed to the downfall of Mubarak. Mubarak, simply put, was not a fighter. He was neither a Gaddafi nor an Assad. He could not have remained after that. That's concerning the character himself. The regime itself was unsustainable on the long run. I think what people missed very importantly about the Arab Spring is not the fact that people revolted. That should have been a given. People do not want to live under such conditions for a long time. But the fact of how easy a regime like the Egyptian one fell. It took the Egyptian people 4 hours on that fateful day, January 28th, to end the Egyptian police. And that tells you something about how we misread the strength of those regimes. So in a sense, I think the question is Egypt today better off? No. Do I think that Egypt will be better off in the future? Highly unlikely. But was the situation itself unsustainable? No. And this brings the question of what are your policy options and the fact that you are generally not dealing with a beauty contest. This is not the most beautiful contest. This is the least ugly girl contest. Mm-hmm. And you're choosing essentially between ugly options.
Yeah, well, that's a fair point. Another question I wanted to put, I was having an animated discussion over dinner the other day about Syria, and the assertion was made that if we move to do anything against Assad, that puts the U.S. on the same side as Al-Qaeda. And I think what that crystallized in my mind is that it's not black and white, but rather it's a competition, that there is dynamism and change. Lots of players are going to be competing for influence. And the question is, do those of us who have a certain set of values and a certain way of looking at the world also compete in trying to support those things or not? And that might be another way of addressing what is, as you say, it's an ugly circumstance, but it doesn't get less ugly by less involvement.
Good.
Yes.
Can I say just
and then Robbie. Yeah.
Why is happening this in Syria from my point of view? This situation in Syria is, in my view, is a result of what's happening in Tunisia and especially in Egypt. The Vatican, take the Vatican, which is much more powerful than the Italian government, just to give you an example.
It is the
extremely, extremely preoccupied about the situation of the Christian in Syria. See what happened in Iraq to the Christians. So the Archbishop of Aleppo 1 month ago went on the French TV news saying, we are in favor of Assad. And I was shocked because I said, oh, who is this guy? It was the Vatican. And also, we have to speak very frankly. I think the Israelis are very happy to have this situation going for years, because it keeps the army, the Syrian army, which is the only serious army threatening Israel, to stay that way. So I don't see repeating Libya, because Libya is different from Syria and so on and so on and so on. It's not this reason. It's just that we are taking some lesson without giving a clear answer. That something, when you move a stone, you don't know what's down. And I was just finished with this. Hillary Clinton 2 Saturdays ago went to Tunis to meet the students. And she was, for the first time, the first American diplomat to be very clear on this point. And few newspapers take care of this. She said, you have to be very clear on tolerance, respect of diversity. This is what I expect from Europe and America. You have to give this message to these people. Don't leave alone the people who are secularists but are not with Ben Ali or Mubarak or Gaddafi. Secularism means, in my opinion, able to tolerate the difference. Not to, I mean.
Robbie, you wanted to say something.
Well, two things that were not mentioned, and they sort of reflect what I believe are the same phenomena, since you mentioned the potential intervention of Israel in Syria, which I don't see happening, and for a number of good reasons. There's a sort of a quote-unquote, after all I've said, but quote-unquote Arab Spring in Israel as well, and that is the radicalization of the ultra-Orthodoxy, where women are discriminated to in public. We're not just talking about what they do within their own communities, but if women are not allowed to sit on a bus that goes through a religious community, that for justifiable reasons brings back Rosa Parks suddenly in Israel. I mean, it's whoever thought about this. Now, it's not simply limited to the bracketing of women from participation in public life. Okay, double entendre here. It means trying to get a hold of power positions vis-a-vis what we would call civic society. And that piece is not mentioned much, but I think people need to worry about it, because if that trend continues, there could be an internal revolt by the secularists who are not exactly happy with that encroachment on secular life. So that's the civil society part in Israel. The second aspect of there's an elephant in this room, that not the flying one that we talked about earlier, but the elephant that up to now I think no one of us mentioned, that is Turkey. In Turkey you have again, it's not an Arab country, so I wouldn't say the Arab Spring, but the pyramid is upside down. The revolution is starting from the top, not from the bottom. And there is a absolute move away from the legacy of Kemal Atatürk. And that is expressing itself not simply in the weakening of the military, which in our minds is always considered the reactionary force. In Turkey, it was actually the glue that sort of held democracy together. That is weakening. There's an increase of radical Islamization, but that is really the least of all troubles, because Turkey and Iran are now vying for hegemony of not just the region, but beyond. And that has implications for the European Common Market, the European Union, and things that, and there are some other issues that we have not discussed, but this just to add to the complexity of the topic.
I want to give Karim the floor, but let me just bring up one point. Both of you use the word secularism, and I keep thinking that that's not the right word.
It's not the religion.
Yeah, I think the word is tolerance. Because in a democratic society, you have to tolerate differences of view, and you have to tolerate that there can be different political parties or governments that take office in succession. And it's not to say that you're eliminating religion from public life. I think that's unrealistic. But I do think that you can try to police tolerance in public life.
Well, the only quick comment that I will make about this is that it's an asymmetrical fight. And it's asymmetrical because you can tolerate somebody and let them practice their religion. Those who are, for whatever others, lack of definition, more fundamentalist, are going to be far less tolerant, and there's no equity and there's no equality in this feud.
Right. But that is the challenge, I think. I think you're right about that problem, and that is why that's the critical issue. Karim, you've been patient.
What you've been talking about is a change of political culture, which takes a long time. And the problem is, what in the middle, what do you do? But what I want to say is, I think that Daniele's usual touch the most delicate and the most politically incorrect of all the discourses. So if you want to be totally politically incorrect, we have to face one issue. That is, he's right. When you take away the stone, you don't know what's underneath. And Libya, for example, is a typical example of it. Because as a patriot, I'm very happy the way it went, and I'm more than happy with where we are. But the analyst has always been, since the beginning, very, very skeptical of what has happened. And I think that as scholars, one day, when all the heat about this is subsided, we should ask ourselves what has really happened. Because what we have seen is that a revolt in a city, spontaneous, in one day becomes an armed revolt immediately after, with the French president jumping from the second day up and down the whole of his own country, yelling at Gaddafi, the same man he hosted, and the same man he allowed to put his tent in the Champs-Élysées, the same man he considered a great leader until the day before, all of a sudden becomes a war criminal, and becomes a war criminal on the basis of a report by a news agency called Al Jazeera, which were 90% false. For the first 5 or 6 or 7 days, Al Jazeera constantly reported rumors, knowing that they were rumors, easily to be checked that they were rumors, and all they did was incense the public opinion of the world to side on the side of the French president, to declare Gaddafi a war criminal, to delegitimize his army, and in the end to allow for the NATO intervention. That is a fact. As I said, on the one hand, I am happy. On the other hand, as a political analyst, I should say, well, what we have had is the news and the foreign president demolishing a regime that, like it or not, until the day before was welcomed all over. Its leader spoke in New York, was received in Rome many times, was received in London, was received in Paris, was the regular government of a country. And I would like to know what country facing a revolt in one of its cities does not send its troops to quell it if it gets out of hand, and so on. And we can go on for many other, but that was just to say that when you take the stone out, you don't know who are these rebels, what's happening, what is going on, and you run the risk of. And by the way, talking about the Catholic Church, Monsignor Martinelli, the Archbishop of Tripoli, spoke against all of these things since the beginning. So you had that voice also in Libya, the same kind of voice that you have in Syria, where people say, why is it happening? Why? What's the reason? And we never heard that other side.
Interesting. Okay, I'm sure there are a lot of comments and questions in the audience, and I'd like to take a few of them, and then we'll come back to a round from the panel. So please, let's see. I start with Jeff Stacy in the back there, and we'll work our way forward. If you can pass the microphone there. Jeff is also a fellow at Center for Transatlantic Relations.
I guess I'll steal everybody's thunder and say thank you for living up to the promise to be politically incorrect from this esteemed panel. Very entertaining, but very illuminating also at the same time. I'm a little curious about the focus on the inability of the world, or journalists in particular, or policymakers, to predict the Arab Spring. I mean, pretty much all those and almost everybody else failed to predict 2 other key things: the end of the Cold War, 9/11. I'm not sure we should be beating each other over our heads too much for not predicting this, but here we are in this situation, and we have to, as I think as one of you put it, deal with this and do the best that we can. And the question is, what do we do? Or maybe I could put it this way. If the biggest concern about these countries is whether so-called Islamic extremists will exercise moderation in power or not, Don't we have a kind of classic hypothesis rather than predicting what will happen? I think you've all cautioned us to be very careful about predicting, especially, I'm not, as an American, going to stand here and predict wonderful things after listening to some very appropriate criticism from you panelists about certain predictions that have been made. But let me put it maybe this way. What is the panel's view of the hypothesis that so-called extreme political Islamic-based movements in power, take the Muslim Brotherhood as the chief example, will or will not, being forced to govern and be criticized and have to deliver services, will this exercise a moderating effect on previous rhetoric and plans, or will it not?
Okay, do extremists get less extreme under the pressures of performing as a government? Right here in the in the row. Yep.
I have a question about the Yemen.
I think you do need it because we're.
I have a question about the Yemen. I wasn't sure. Someone described this week as Afghanistan with a beach, and I was wondering, does democratization and revolution have any real effect in a failed state?
Does
do you have an opinion on Yemen, or whether or not
yeah.
the Arab Spring will make things better in the Yemen, or does it even not matter because the government doesn't have a big
where does
footprint
Yemen go?
anyway?
And okay, further on in the end of that row.
Thank you. Just two very brief comments. One to Dr. Moro, which is that I think, having been in Israel just 3-4 weeks ago, talking to security officials, I think actually the biggest fear of the Israeli security officials is precisely the continuation of this troubling situation in Syria, because the biggest fear they have is that weapons of mass destruction, chemical weapons, will fall in the hands of Hezbollah, which could happen if there's a messy transition. And I think there's now consensus that the best thing for Israel would be to see Assad go very quickly, because he is that's the biggest asset that Iran has, and Iran is seen in Israel as the biggest threat. So that's one comment. And a second to Professor Friedmann. I think that the comparison with Rosa Parks is simply wrong of what's happening in Israel, because, of course, Rosa Parks was a situation where the police enforced.
I'm sorry, I didn't get
Rosa
the first.
Parks comparison.
Oh, Rosa Parks.
Rosa Parks. And of course, in the United States, in those days, in the South, the police enforced the segregation of blacks on buses. In Israel, it's illegal. And Netanyahu, just yesterday at the policy conference at AIPAC, also reaffirmed that it's illegal. He will act against. So I think there's a fundamental difference between two situations.
Okay, two helpful comments. Thank you. Gergely Larga, a Hungarian fellow at our center, right here.
Thank you. One of the features of the Arab Spring is the so-called Sunni-Shia power struggle. We see that in Syria, in Bahrain. I wonder what the panelists think if there would be a war between Israel and Iran. How would this affect this equation? How would this affect the political situation in Syria and Bahrain? Thank you.
Sure. And we have one here in the front.
Toscano, the Fulbright scholar. Did Arab Spring have any influence or impact on Central Asian states? And what kind of?
Yeah, has there been a Central Asian impact of the Arab Spring? Okay, I think I'll close it there, and I'd like to give each of our panelists a chance to address these questions or any final words that they would like to make. We'll just go down the line. So Samuel will start, and we'll go this way.
Let me take the part about the Muslim Brotherhood's moderation and so on. I think there are a number of questions here. The first is that of moderation. The second is that of failure. Those are the two basic assumptions in the city. Concerning moderation, there's a number of points that we need to take care of. First is the rise of the Salafis. If the Muslim Brotherhood is used in the past to be the radicals on the right, now they're being challenged from their own right. This will be the most important dynamic in the future of Islamism in Egypt. even if the Muslim Brotherhood is moderate, as some claim, even if it is more pragmatic, as I view it, and willing to deal with the reality of governance and to give up some of its dogma for ruling, how they deal with a challenge from the right, I think, is the most important factor there. We've seen in Parliament incidents of those Salafis challenging the head of Parliament, the Muslim Brotherhood leader, on various Islamic issues. So that dynamic is important to watch. The second consideration in it is the fact of the base. If the leadership, as I believe, is willing to accommodate reality and deal with the facts on the ground and moderate in this sense, how will they deal with their base? Their base is much more radical from them. The most important aspect here is the fact that the Muslim Brotherhood has not produced a single theologian or any man of anyone considered a serious thinker since the death of Hassan al-Banna, with the more extreme exception of Sayyid Qutb. This has resulted in that the Muslim Brotherhood members are being indoctrinated in the basic books that the Salafis use. So in the absence of any serious discourse inside the movement, of course, to become a member of the Muslim Brotherhood is not like joining the Boy Scouts in America. It's a process that takes 8 years of indoctrination and examination. And to go through those 8 years, you read the same books that the Salafis use. This means that even if the leadership tries to move in a more moderate direction, they might be losing their own base to the more radical Salafis. So I think those are the two most important aspects in that question.
Right. And part of what I think you just said is there may be a bit of an enforcement mechanism so that even if those in power may be tempted to moderate, there may be an enforcement against that. Daniel.
Just a couple of quick points on Israel, since we've had the Israeli Prime Minister here. I think just recently I saw a piece out of Israel where he was quoted as talking about the expense in terms of defense needs for Israel from the Arab Spring. And this is a key concern for the Israelis. One would, think ahead and think, well, what effect might this have on U.S. aid levels for Israel, in budgets coming up? There was also an emphasis that we saw by President Obama. We've seen it before in his speech to AIPAC, where he's urging a solution of the Arab-Palestinian conflict because of the impacts of the Arab Spring. You heard that last year, and you heard it again from him on Sunday. I think a key point for all of this is the extent to which this is a long-term proposition. I mean, all of these situations, all of these separate situations that the president often says and his officials often say have to be addressed individually. We're not going to see a resolution of this for years, and you have to start looking to the transition between administrations, whether or not Obama is reelected, what the next administration will do, whether it's Romney or Gingrich or whoever it's going to be, and how, for example, the links will be made with some of the Islamists or the Islamic parties to keep linking the kinds of things that the president talked about in his speech and which other people have written about, for example, using the leverage gained from economic support that the United States gives to influence the development of the political situation there, nonviolence, adherence to democracy and democratic values.
Thank you. Karim.
Thank you very much. Very quickly, 2 points. First of all, I agree in general with you, Tadros, but I think that if somebody is part of the Muslim Brotherhood, is not part of the Salafi, is because he wants to militate with the Muslim Brotherhood. And to me, the parallel that we should see is the one with the communist parties in Europe in the 60s and the 70s. They were reading the same thing as those who were to their far left, but they were not extremists in the end. They remained mainstream, and once they were co-opted into the governments, once they were co-opted into the political spectrum, they regenerated and they moved towards the regular realm of the political system. And that is a hope that we have to have for the Muslim Brotherhood. We cannot think that they will radicalize, therefore keep them to the margins. We have to bring them in and right is then keep an observation on what they do and control them. Second, the Shia Sunni, I have the belief or the impression, and I may be wrong, that if we can read it as a Shia Sunni clash, but or simply we can read it as a majority against a minority. that oppress them. And Bahrain and Syria are one the opposite of the other. A majority of Sunni in Syria has been oppressed by Alawi minority and some other, and they could have been a Sunni minority. I think just any minority that govern is seen not nicely by the majority who is subject to it. So it's more in our reading that there is a reality, a Sunni Shia clash, and we make all these visions, Iran intervening and the Shia crescent, and all those nice theories that then help us putting more money in the wrong hands. But even Bahrain is a Shia Sunni, but that's because it's 80% of Shiite who happen to be, because they are Shiite, oppressed by a 20% minority. That's my take.
Interesting. And I just want to illustrate something. So in one point that you just made in your first point, rather than Daniel's point is that if you're an extremist group, then there may be an enforcement mechanism. The alternative is also that just because the extremists are the loudest and most coherent doesn't make them a majority or make them more successful over time. Okay. So both of that is, again, complex thing to think about. Right. Ravi.
I'll start with the easy one, and that's Rosa Parks. I did not imply, not only that I didn't say, that the situation between Rosa Parks and what happens in a given neighborhood in Jerusalem is legally the same. I realize it full well that those were laws and this is a situation. I actually emphasize that we're talking about the civil society. And the civil society has strifes between segments that are trying to impose their regulations in public. And as long as those internal regulations were imposed in private, nobody, in fact the majority, tolerated the minority's behavior. When the minority wants to impose its way of life, so to speak, on the majority, that's when the problem begins. And of course it's not condoned by the state, it's not condoned by the law, but keep in mind that some of them are in the coalition government and there are political prices to pay, and it's not a two-party system over there, about 11, which is better than 33, but they used to have it. So I'm less concerned about the legal issue in Israel. I'm far more concerned about social processes of asymmetry. So that's the issue of Rosa Parks. I wanted to talk a bit about definitional issues of prediction, which I think you raised in the first question. I think that, I mean, if we go back to Auguste Comte in France, who said that, I mean, in French, it really sounds much better. It's savoir pour prévoir and prévoir pour pouvoir, which is basically we want to know in order to predict, and we want to predict in order to be able to do something about our situation. Well, that piece of the to-do is the devising of policy. And what it is that we want to do, that's the one that is in question, that's the one that is in debate. The reason we fail miserably, I'm not sure why you're surprised that we fail from a policy and foreign affairs. Why aren't you surprised that we fail from a military intelligence perspective? And I'm not just talking about the false intelligence that we had in Iraq. You look at the 73 war between Egypt and Israel, the Israeli intelligence failed miserably. And everybody thinks that the Israeli intelligence is invincible. And here is the rub. Intelligence doesn't fail because of information. Intelligence fails because of assessment. And the reason that they fail because of assessment is because intelligence lacks one issue, and that is working assumptions. Once you place working assumptions within that framework, then it would be still possible to fail, but it's like building a good research methodology that is guided by some hypotheses, by some questions that you're asking, and that is really missing. And then given the immediacy of gratification of some politicians and the immediate pressures, no wonder that people are doomed to fail. Now, I'll touch just the issue of Iran very quickly. Frankly, I have no clue.
Yeah, that was quick.
Very quickly, I mean, regarding intelligence, I think that human beings would tend to think in terms of a bell curve. So what really worries me is not the fact that nobody was able to predict this, because, I mean, if Ben Ali came to power around 1986 in a relatively, I mean, in a coup, some sort of coup against Bourguiba, but it wasn't any kind of problematic. Why couldn't he be, I mean, if he had been there for 25 years, why couldn't he continue? What surprises me, what worries me a little bit, is the fact that right now, in a very fluid situation, I think that everybody is reacting. Obviously, the U.S. has its elections, Europe has its financial crisis, and that's a serious thing. But that's one thing. About Islamists reaching power, I think that on the one hand, it would force them to moderate. On the other hand, again, is the thing that they can have challenges from the right. And then, I mean, let's not forget either, I mean, if you read a little bit about behavioral economics, people don't vote for their own interest many times. I mean, there's a guy who, I mean, the second favorite Republican guy in today's election who considers snobbish thinking about everybody going to college. This is in the United States, not in Egypt. So, I mean, you can have the Islamists in power and doing a pretty loosey job, I mean, not necessarily crashing the economy, and staying there either through coalitions with other groups, with the military, which controls the economy in certain countries like Egypt, and so on. And finally, regarding Iran, I have no clue either. The only thing I can say is that, I mean, it's not really about the Shia-Sunni divide, which I think is very strongly influenced by the minority-majority game. But right now, no matter what the media says, in the oil industry, nobody thinks that there's going to be a war, at least till the end of this year. And what drives the oil prices is weather, not Iran.
Yeah.
Okay. Daniele?
No, I just want to say one thing. I still don't know the answer, honestly, to the big question, and I hope we will see if it's possible to have an answer in the next few months. It is possible to have an Islamic majority governing a country respecting the minorities, religion or political, and so that's an open question for me. Thank you.
Okay, I saw Mike Hotzel's hand up here, and I just very quickly, Mike, if there was a point you wanted to raise.
Yeah, with regard to whether or not the United States should intervene militarily in Syria and Senator McCain, with all the boundless respect I have for Senator McCain, you know that's genuine. I don't see how anybody could look at what the debate has been in the last 3 or 4 days over Iran and seriously consider the United States intervening at this time militarily in Syria. The number one responsibility of the President of the United States is to guarantee the security of the American people. If, in fact, a nuclear-armed Iran is such a dire threat, I tend to think that it is, but honestly, disagree. But people on both sides of the aisle in this country agree, with very few exceptions, that it is a dire, mortal threat, proliferation. We all know all the ramifications. It's a mystery to me how people should seriously consider that we would get involved to try to suppress the Syrian air defenses. Syria has an air force, no competition for Israel, but other than that, or perhaps Turkey's, but it's a real air force. It would not be a cakewalk like Libya. There is a moral imperative, but the fact is, just because you can't intervene to save persecuted people in every country in the world doesn't mean that you're immoral. We have, unfortunately, you can tick off the list in the last 20 years of areas that we did not intervene in. So, I mean, I have to say, putting that into that context, now, what would I do? I would certainly try to get arms. We have allies, we have friends. We've worked with these people before. Get as many arms as you can in there. Clearly, it would be tremendously to the benefit of the United States geopolitically if Assad would fall, because it would be a disaster for Iran. The former head of the Mossad even said that we ought to cook a deal with the Russians, assuring them that they can hold on to their 2 bases no matter what government comes to power. There's a lot that we can be doing, but I think a direct military intervention at this point is really almost otherworldly naive.
Right. Okay. Thank you very much. A very helpful comment. I want to thank all of our panelists. We didn't answer the question on Central Asia, and I think the answer is not yet. And on the question of how would Sunnis view Israel and Iran, the enemy of my enemy is a good thing. And on Yemen, I do think it's different than Afghanistan. It's a long discussion as to why, but I think there's a